much, Aydogdu, and welcome to Tell Me. Nail-biting, a cliffhanger, almost like a Hollywood blockbuster. After several days, the US presidential election finally has a winner. Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Many would argue that top of Biden's agenda will be to heal the wounds of a divided nation.
So let me be clear. We are campaigning as a Democrat, but I will govern as an American president. My friends, I'm confident we'll emerge victorious. But this will not be my victory alone or our victory alone. It'll be a victory for the American people, for our democracy, for America. And there will be no blue states and red states when we win.
America First was the mantra of his predecessor, Donald Trump, who had an alternate view on tackling the coronavirus crisis and climate change and trade. Now, it won Trump praise, but also angered others. So before the President-elect Joe Biden settles into the Oval Office, we want to discuss the challenges that he faces. Can he put the fractured country back together, and can America heal itself again? So joining me on the program today to discuss further on this, journalist and presenter Ryan Chilcote, who's worked extensively in the US, and assistant professor of political science at Emory University, Renard Sexton. Both of you, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Tell Me. So Ryan, starting off with you there. First of all this suspense, anxiety and the surprises along the way. How do you feel about this election? What are your emotions?
I think a lot of people are happy that this is over and that it ended more or less in a civilized fashion. Obviously, there were concerns that that the election could remain contested until almost January the 20th, when no matter what, a new president has to come into the Oval Office if the sitting president hasn't been reelected. And there were concerns that there would be huge violence. So obviously there has been some trouble in the run-up to this weekend, but a lot of people will be relieved that it wasn't as bad as perhaps they thought it might have been.
And Renard, what about you? How do you feel?
Well, I think the polls that we saw of voters right around the time of the election suggest a real divide between Democrats and Republicans in terms of what matters most. So, Democrats are mostly concerned about COVID and healthcare in general, whereas Republicans are really worried about the economy. And so that divide is going to continue even after this election, and it's going to be up to, a likely divided government pending a runoff in Georgia to see exactly how they're going to address the concerns of both of the parties.
Okay, well, we will go into more details into those challenges, especially in different aspects. But we also have viewers out of the US who have sent in videos about what this means to them, if it's about leadership or if it's more about the country and what kind of country they want to live in. So we have Jordan there from Virginia telling us what he wants.
I want to live in an America where there is a shared sense of unity instead of division, where intellectual honesty, understanding, and empathy are at the core of our values. There doesn't seem to be a sense of neutral ground that can be found between opposing viewpoints today, and many are quick to ridicule, criticize, and attack those we don't agree with. I want to see that both our citizens and our elected officials promote a healthy relationship with truth and possess a level of teachability so that all Americans can be heard equally. That said, I want to see that science is promoted instead of conspiracy, and that our government doesn't disregard objective fact, especially surrounding the coronavirus and the climate. I want to see substantial police reform undertaken so that officers have the resources and necessary training for their jobs, and that we hold them accountable if justice isn't carried out. And now, more than ever, I want to live in an America where the working class is able to have a fair and living wage so they can provide for themselves. I believe substantial economic reform is necessary, and the government should provide a larger safety net for those who fall on hard times. That would also include guaranteed basic universal health care for every U.S. citizen. And finally, I want to see a presidential administration that I'm not ashamed of. The character and actions of our leaders are what the rest of the world sees and is emulated by the citizens. So I want an administration that promotes selflessness instead of selfishness. One that doesn't conflate force, violence, and hate with patriotism. A president that can have a discourse with someone else of an opposing viewpoint without attacking or belittling them. Someone who can cooperate with our allies and doesn't isolate America from the rest of the world, but also stands up to bad actors on the world stage. Someone who advocates for civil rights and will denounce white supremacy with conviction. And someone who can put his popularity and ego aside for the greater good of the country. Simply put, I want a leader in the Oval Office.
Ryan, do you think most Americans share that view with Jordan, especially about leadership and truth and healthy?
Well, most Americans would suggest a solid majority. Yeah, I'm not convinced that that was the most representative group of voices right there. I think if you were looking for a representative group of voices, you would also want to have maybe someone say that they don't want the left to dictate what is right and wrong to them. I think that's something that, in my reporting, what I've seen in the United States is clearly one of the cultural aspects of what's going on in the United States. A lot of people on the right feel that the Democratic Party has become too orientated around social justice and hypocritically dictates to them how they should behave. I'm not saying I agree with that viewpoint. I'm saying that is a very serious and very broadly held viewpoint in the United States. And I think one thing that will really help in if we want to move towards a more bipartisan situation in the United States is if somehow the Democratic Party can reposition itself, repackage itself as a party that is as interested in the economy as it is in issues around social justice.
Renard, let's bring you in here. So as Jordan mentioned there, especially in terms of coronavirus pandemic, and he said, I want an administration who promotes science and instead of conspiracy. How much of an impact do you think the pandemic has had on the outcome of this election? And if Trump would have played things differently, united the country against measures, do you think the response would have been different?
Well, when you look at the numbers, 2/3 of the country are very concerned about the coronavirus. And obviously there is a partisan divide. In general, independents and Democrats are more concerned, but a lot of Republicans are also very concerned. And so, had the president played it differently, yes, I think the result would have looked quite different. In general, presidents that oversee, strong economic growth as incumbents tend to perform quite well during their reelection campaigns. And given that it was reasonably close, I think with a different set of circumstances, with a more robust federal response, and therefore likely a quicker economic recovery, then I think, Trump could have pulled it off. And
did that surprise you that it was so close?
I mean, I think the society is so polarized right now. It's not surprising that a lot of partisans, nonetheless, voted for their candidate of choice. I mean, even though quite a number of Republicans chose not to vote for Trump, when you look at the Republican congressional candidates and Senate candidates, they, generally speaking, ran ahead of Trump in most places. That margin was not very big. So there were not very many candidates that were choosing, for example, to vote for a Republican for Congress, but nonetheless for Joe Biden. So those, strong partisan attachments, which, as Ryan was suggesting, is largely around these sort of cultural, social issues, can overcome even what many people do view to be a rather disastrous response to the coronavirus.
Also, what's really interesting about this election is the huge turnout, the huge voter turnout, possibly the highest since 1908. So what does that tell us about Americans and what do they want, Renard?
So the turnout, I think, is in part being driven by people that are very afraid of what happens when the other party wins. And, recent studies have shown that people recently have been more motivated around that kind of anti-vote than necessarily in the in-favor vote, so to speak. So I think a lot of people were very concerned about one side or the other actually winning. So in some sense, I think the turnout is terrific. And the fact is that a number of the coronavirus-related measures that were taken by states to ease the difficulty of voting also probably made it simpler. Texas, for example, extended the number of early voting days by nearly a week, and a number of states removed their restrictions on mail ballots. And so therefore, while ahead of time we might have thought that the pandemic would reduce overall enthusiasm, it may have actually made it easier for a lot of people.
And why do you think they felt the need, though, to vote? Because looking at these numbers, I mean, if it's right, then since 1908, that's huge. So why do you think they felt the need to go and vote? And I believe that was much lower compared to 2016.
So in 2016, you had a number of Democrats and independents that chose to stay home because they weren't convinced by either of the candidates. So they didn't like either one. Now, I think it's clear that Democrats and independents were highly motivated to vote against Donald Trump because they felt like he was a real disaster. On the other hand, there were a lot of Republicans that were uncertain about Trump. They, maybe supported other Republicans in the primary. There was, uncertainty about how he would govern. They thought he was maybe a little bit of a powder keg. But those Republicans pretty much came home. And in fact, when we look at South Florida, there are a lot of, Hispanic Republicans that actually voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 that came home and supported Trump this time around. So in general, what you saw was people that were very uncertain in 2016, didn't necessarily like both candidates, and this time around were on the Democratic side very motivated because they did not like Trump at all, and on the Republican side, reasonably motivated because they felt that Trump was a stronger option.
Well, a lot here to talk about, of course, but let's also watch the video by Tara Kangaroo from Los Angeles.
Hello everyone, my name is Tara Kangaroo and I'm a journalist and also an American voter. For this upcoming election, I want to see a leader who stands for the true American values that would celebrate diversity, inclusion, and unity. I want to see a leader who would unite not just Americans, but also the international community. I want to see a United States that would join its allies on the global stage. And more so, I want to see a leader who puts public service on the forefront of his policy making. And ultimately, I want to see a leader that would not be selfish and would think about the citizens of this great country and the well-being of the United States, but also the international community.
So, Ryan, do you think Joe Biden can deliver those promises, and what kind of strategy do you see in the change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the international community, I mean, it depends on where in the world you're looking at. But I think that, say, in Western Europe, they'll be delighted to see a President Biden. Clearly, everybody in Europe was, to put it colloquially, thrown by President Trump when he came into office. And he's pretty much thrown transatlantic relations into disarray. It pretty much threw them into disarray immediately, and they have remained that way. I mean, I covered President Trump when he came to Europe. I've been to the NATO meetings, the G8, G20 meetings. It's chaos, and there isn't a Western European leader, or certainly aren't many Western European leaders, that would like to see those continue. I think they'll see Biden as a friend, a person that believes in international coalitions. He's going to go back into the Paris climate deal. There'll be a lot of joy about that. There's no question. I think the Russians will be disappointed that President Trump's out. I think they liked him, but I personally, my own little analytical view is that actually this could be good for Russia, because it was quite clear that the Congress and the American people were never going to let a President Trump cut a deal, normalize relations with Russia, because many Americans believe that he was actually kind of controlled by the Russians. So at least with a Biden, that means, he comes with a mandate to actually do a real deal with the Russians to try and normalize relations. And I suspect that that's the tack that the Russians are going to take immediately. China's the big one. I think the surprise is that China is going to continue with the rhetoric and with the tough talk and with action against China. I don't think there's going to be a huge change there. And if there's anything that, say, the Europeans are going to disagree on with the Biden administration, it's going to be China.
Well, of course, so much to talk about and so many challenges ahead. But let's watch another video from a viewer now, Kira Neither from LA.
Hey everyone, I'm Key Renee and I'm from Los Angeles, California. Here are a few things that I think need to be changed with this upcoming election. So first, I would love for us to continue with prison reform, first by going back and reevaluating the cases of any judge who had a documented history of racial disparities in their prison sentencing. Because black men should not still today be getting sentenced to 6 times as much as white men for the same exact offense. Next, I would love to see liquor stores replaced with business incubators in underserved communities. I feel that everyone should have the same access to the tools, knowledge, and resources needed to create generational wealth and also forge a path to ownership. Last, I would love to see us invest more in Black female entrepreneurs when it comes to general entrepreneurship and the tech space. I would just love to see more programs and resources made readily available. These are some of the things that I would like to see changed with the results of this election.
Ryan, so continuing with you there, so US has a real problem with racism, and this year has proven that black people are still being treated unfairly after the killing of George Floyd, and it is very clear that the nation is divided. So in 2016, many black voters decided not to vote at all. Has anything changed today?
Yeah, you could argue, and the president of the NAACP has argued this, that black voters decided this election in the sense that they were 12% of the electorate and the last votes counted. So it was their votes that pushed many of the mail-in votes, many places like Georgia, that actually in the end pushed President Biden over the line to get the 270 votes. Some of the things we just heard about that your guest there was wishing for, I think may be difficult for President Biden to achieve. I think there's going to be a real strong push from the base of the Democratic Party, from minorities, from the political left to solve this issue of racial disparity and inequality. But it's a tough one to solve, and it's a particularly tough one to solve if you don't have the Senate on your side. And the Senate may not be on President Biden's side in all ways on this issue. So I think that's one to watch for. Business incubators, that's probably a bipartisan issue. I suspect the federal government's going to be willing to throw everything at at the economy and trying to get it going and encouraging entrepreneurship. Racial diversity, that's a much more controversial, much more complicated issue.
What do you think, Renard?
Well, what's interesting is back in June, the Black Lives Matters protests around, following George Floyd's killing, reached about 67% support in the population, including among a significant number of Republicans. And it suggested, that there is this latent interest in the society to sort of resolve some of these issues. However, as the protests have sort of receded in the national conversation, that level of support has dropped. So it's now in between 50 and 55%. And the vast majority of the drop-off has come among Republicans. And so that, as Ryan was talking about, the real issue here is that as racial injustice becomes a partisan issue, it becomes much more difficult for the federal government to resolve it, because really to get the kind of change you want through Congress, you're going to need a bipartisan vote. So to the extent that Republican senators feel like their base is interested in it, I think you're going to see willingness to pass something significant. But to the extent that, in the aftermath of the election, it remains primarily Democrats and independents that want to see this, it's going to be very tricky getting significant, meaningful reform through.
Okay, I do want to share, though, a quote by a black voter who said, we can get it up there on the screen now, "I vote because so many people fought for me and to be able to have a voice, but I honestly don't have faith in my government. I just keep my trust and faith in God that he will protect me and my family, keep us safe, and no matter who is in office." So I believe many share also the view that the system is sort of failing to protect them. Well, moving on from that topic to another, climate change. Ryan, so one of the challenges is of course climate change, and as planet is nearly at a point of no return, meaning that disaster on the ecosystem and the communities across the globe. And we know that Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord and said it undermined America's economy. So will Joe Biden take real action here?
Well, he's going to take action. There's no question about that. He's made it very clear. He could not have a more different view of climate change than President Trump. But again, just like with issues when it comes to social justice, racial justice, he's going to run into the problem of building support for the kind of measures that his base would like to see. He's simply not going to get Republicans in the Senate to sign off on some of the more radical is, I guess, a subjective term, but some of the more hard-hitting, impactful decisions. So yes, of course, he'll join the Paris Agreement. Yes, there will be a movement to bring in a greener economy, but will oil companies be punished? Will shale, as the Trump company, will oil companies be punished? Will fracking be scaled back? I don't think so. I think that this is where we're going to see modest change, definitely change, but probably taking us back maybe 70% to where we were under President Obama, maybe not even all the way to where we were under President Obama, probably not further, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, let's watch another video there. This is from Ryan in Atlanta.
As an Englishman in America, the America I want to wake up to tomorrow is one that's more tolerant, more empathetic. It's one where the political discourse is not binary. We have multiple parties. We have an ability to compromise and to cooperate ultimately, and listen to different arguments and be willing to agree to disagree where that's necessary. I want a situation where basic human rights aren't politicized. Today, race and gender equality, the environment and climate change, even public health is politicized to a degree that in a binary political world, we are just set against one another. So I would love to see those things change, and I would love for us as a group to look at what society as a whole can do better together.
Renard, so now let's come to leadership and about looking at Trump. I mean, he was sort of setting the headlines nearly every day for all of us. So looking at Joe Biden, what kind of character, language, leadership will we see?
Ryan's point about the binary choice, I think what you actually see when we talk to voters and when you look at the data, voters have quite more heterodox views than the sort of strict partisanship would suggest. So, a real example of that is that in Florida, at the same time that, Donald Trump won a convincing majority, a $15 minimum wage referendum passed with more than 60% of the vote. So at the same time people were, embracing Republican candidates, they were also basically repudiating the Republican line on minimum wage and on better economic circumstances for low-income workers. And I think that's the sort of thing that the incoming president will need to do, is really focus on issues more than necessarily maybe the sort of partisan red meat, because there actually are quite a number of things. I mean, it's just to go back to climate change, 39% of Republicans agree that the government should be doing more around climate change. And that's a number that you wouldn't see on most other issues. And I think that although Ryan is right that in Congress, there's going to be a lot of opposition to doing things, major things on climate change, there actually could be quite a bit more public support and pressure to taking some significant action, at least at the executive level.
Okay, well, I'm coming towards the end of the program now, about 2 minutes left. So, Renard, this is the last one to you. What is the biggest challenge ahead for Biden, and what kind of leadership will we see?
At the end of the day, the coronavirus is the biggest challenge the United States is facing right now. It's in part because of the response so far has been so fractured and with a lack of leadership. So resolving the coronavirus crisis and then helping to get the economy back on track is going to be the core thing that the Biden administration is going to have to resolve. I think that you see some support in Congress, a growing level of support to take the significant action required, but it's going to take the country also sort of pulling together and being willing to take those hard choices.
Well, Ryan, last one to you. So I believe when it comes to the biggest challenge, you'll say racial injustice. But so what is the biggest challenge ahead, and what kind of leadership will we see?
I think the biggest challenge beyond the two that we just heard there will be, can the president and the people around him present a kind of unifying message and vision for the country? There will be a lot of people after this election who will say that it was illegitimate, and will, the federal government has sort of lost their trust. And I think that's going to be a big issue. And so the challenge for President Biden will be to not affirm many voters' concerns that he has a secret partisan agenda, that will alienate them. If he can convince them that, in fact, I'm your friend too, as he's been saying in speeches, then he could do pretty well. If he doesn't, it could be over for him pretty quickly.
Well, Ryan Chilcote and Renard Sexton, it was a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you very much for joining this edition of Tell Me. And that's it from us here on Tell Me. Thank you for watching us. And you can always share your views and opinions with me on my Insta, Chacha. Do stay safe and sane until next week.